Good morning. I am Kevin Goldberg, Vice President and First Amendment expert at Freedom Forum, a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. I may be a little biased. That was pretty great, right? That video is pretty great. It is totally consistent with our mission at Freedom Forum to foster First Amendment freedoms for all. We do this through educating, engaging, and inspiring the public. And the video you saw literally embodies all three of these things. I think we can agree with. And that's why it's going to be a cornerstone of our work for years to come. I suspect you will agree as well that our mission and our work are more important than ever in the same way that our next panel, protecting free speech from the campus to the newsroom, is so important right now as well. The campus protests that have occurred since October 7th, 2023 in particular, have revealed conflicting public views about, but also declining public support for, the freedoms of speech and assembly in particular. Protests were being shut down, and now many foreign students involved are facing the loss of their student visas, which in turn has led others to self-censor. Freedom of the press, of course, is under attack as well, as political leaders invoke libel accusations to discredit journalists and curtail press freedom. Just last week, a court rejected Sarah Palin's claim that a 2017 New York Times editorial had defamed her. This is one of the latest examples, that case, of efforts to challenge the landmark 1964 Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan. And while this decision is a victory for the New York Times in the short term, it may actually provide more fodder for attacking New York Times versus Sullivan over the long term. In March, of course, President Trump barred the Associated Press from the White House press pool following the AP's refusal to use the term Gulf of America. A court has ruled that barring the AP is unconstitutional, but the fight continues. President Trump has filed lawsuits against several who have criticized him, including two major television networks, ABC and CBS, and has actually threatened another suit against the New York Times for describing the lawsuit against CBS as frivolous. So it continues to spin and grow. I'm sure everyone in this room as well is acutely aware of the attacks on public media, from threats to eliminating funding for PBS and NPR to firing members of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. There's so much more, of course, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop and have our experts talk about this. I'm sure our distinguished panelists will add to that list as they examine the current threats to the First Amendment and explore the steps necessary to safeguard it as we strive to uphold the foundations of our democracy. The panel will be moderated by Martha Minow, Harvard University's 300th anniversary university professor. As a renowned scholar in constitutional law and an advocate for human rights, her knowledge will help guide this urgent conversation. Joining her are several distinguished panelists: Mchangama, Samantha Barbas, Joel Simon, Jelani Cobb, and as I just found out a few minutes ago, I will be joining them to discuss certain aspects that Michael Giarrusso, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, would have covered. So I hope everybody will join me on the stage, and I really look forward to this next conversation. Thank you.
Hey, team.
Hey. Hello.
Well, we're so grateful, Kevin, to you for joining us. In addition to what Kevin described as the lineup, I just have to acknowledge that the backdrop is the extraordinary challenges to the business model of journalism, the distributional methods, the generational differences in even seeking information, much news, the doxing of journalists. We can go on. It is a very challenging time, and that is why I am starting with Jelani. What are you seeing right now in this moment of journalism? What are you telling students? What are you advising them? And if you're willing, who's a journalist?
Oh, wow. That's a lot. So, to start, with the first, what are we seeing? We're seeing the same things that, lots of other people are seeing. We're seeing it maybe, from a closer vantage point. As I've pointed out, I'm the dean of Columbia Journalism School. We've seen an administration that is extraordinarily hostile to news organizations and journalism, and exceptionally hostile to higher education we are a news organization that exists inside higher education. So we're in the kind of Venn overlap of both of these things. And so we get a kind of secondary effect of like what's happening in both arenas. For us, we've encountered a question that I haven't resolved, and it's something that we feel acutely, but something that affects really every journalism program in the country, which is that we invite, particularly for international students, we invite international students to our campus and to our university, and we're now inviting them to engage in behavior, i.e. reporting, that may put their visa status in jeopardy. And so we have not found a kind of legal solution for this, or a set of attorneys. The one thing that we've learned is that there's not a whole ton of pro bono immigration work being done right now. And so we're trying to find ways to protect our students, because reporting has to happen, and people have stigmatized reporting in all of these ways. To the other question, there were some others in between, but I think I lost some of those. But the one about who is a journalist, my working definition has been a journalist is a person who dispassionately gathers and disseminates information in the public interest. And I think that has been, what, of all the disparate ways that people do the work that we do, that's the kernel of what we have in common. And so for all the people, this is an exceptionally, treacherous time for people who do that particular act, dispassionately gathering information and disseminating in the public interest.
Thank you. Joel, given the challenges of this time, how is media responding? How should media be responding? And don't tell me it's our media, because it's an is, right?
Yes. Well, I think what's interesting, just listening to the interventions this morning, listening to what Jelani had to say, listening to what Marty Barron laid out as the challenges that the media is facing, listening to what you presented as sort of the financial model, I think it really depends on how we understand this moment and how we perceive the threats. And I think there are different views on that. I happen to think that we are moving quickly through in a period of authoritarian consolidation, and that the threat to press freedom and the most fundamental exercise of journalistic activity is at stake. And if that's your perception of the moment, then the specific actions you have to take to defend your rights and ensure that you can do your job have to be at the top of the hierarchy of priorities. Obviously, there are many challenges that we face as journalists and as media institutions, but I would argue that everything should be viewed, we're not going to solve the economic challenges, we're not going to solve the problem of news deserts or trust or credibility if we can't defend our rights. So I would put that at the top of the very top of the pyramid. And then the question is, how are we doing? And here I would say, not great, not great. I mean, I think you're going to talk about we've heard about some of the challenges already. I would add, public media is under attack, access is under attack, we're systematically being undermined by officials at every level. The media's facing lawsuits. It's capitulating to some of those lawsuits. And then we haven't even talked about VOA, the decimation of the funding for global media around the world with the cutbacks at USAID. That's just rippled around the world. So it is a very, very precarious moment. And the very strengths of the media in a democratic society are our diversity and our skepticism and our independence. And these are the very same things that can be weaponized against us when we need to come together and defend our rights. And I see that happening, unfortunately. And I think the only way to really consolidate and kind of create a common front is to isolate the fundamental issue that unites us, and that is a fairly narrow conception of press freedom as a fundamental right. Everything else will
Fall under that.
will create some level of division. And so I think hopefully we'll hear about this from the other panelists, but I think we have to kind of unite around the somewhat narrow and fundamental conception of the basic rights that we need in order to exercise journalism, and I don't think that's happened yet.
Kevin, maybe you can jump in here. The AP has been in the focal point for some of the administration's unhappiness. Can you help us understand that or the larger context?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the larger context after hearing what Jelani and Joel have said. And it's interesting because you look at this administration and some people say, well, they're just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And they also have been working off, they supposedly been working off the Project 2025 and are much more organized in a second term as to what they want to do. And there's elements of both of that here. They are certainly pushing all of the norms that we had previously believed to have existed, 100 years of tradition of who gets to decide exactly who will be covering these briefings, who will be in the press pool, who will be traveling with the president. They also seem to have clearly studied the law because the arguments they are making are based in some reality. I want to give just a little background, right? When this happened, everybody said, well, Jim Acosta got his press pass back. He was singled out in the first term of the Trump presidency, so obviously the AP is going to win. It's obviously more nuanced than that, and we were talking backstage about a case from the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and I promise I won't go full legal on you. But it involved the governor of Maryland at the time, Robert Ehrlich, shutting out 2 reporters from the Baltimore Sun and saying, don't talk to these people, don't invite them to limited press conferences, don't answer their questions, don't return their calls. And he actually won that case. And in that case, the Fourth Circuit had said, look, it was 2 reporters, not an entire publication. It was because of disputes over favorable versus unfavorable treatment, not the use of one term and clear viewpoint discrimination because they won't use that term. And they also said that you have to still invite them to all other legal, you have to still answer all the other legal requirements of the job, answer their public records request. If there's an open event, you can't just push them out. So the White House now is stepping over some of those lines. This is much broader. It's clearly coming down to a single viewpoint discrimination, and that is what the court eventually found in granting the preliminary injunction to the AP. But now, of course, the next step is the next day the White House still turns around and is keeping reporters out. And in fact goes so far as to answer the viewpoint discrimination claim by saying, well, the other wire services are now going to, rather than putting the AP in, we're going to take the other wire services out. So there's your viewpoint discrimination claim off the books. It's almost like they kind of saw that part coming. Of note, one thing that just in concluding, there are 2 kind of avenues I see to the AP restoring its status. Number one is that a court sees through that ruse of pulling back all wire services. The other might be that the court looks at this as completely irrational because really in this case, and in a case that people didn't pay attention to the next day involving a small individual reporter by the name of Simon Ateba, the United States District Court of Appeals ruled that many of these areas in the White House are what we call limited purpose public forums or non-public forums. And the rule, the White House can then set the rules for access as long as they're rational and they're viewpoint neutral. So again, will the White House jump on one of those 2 things is what we're going to be watching going forward. But clearly they've eradicated norms that have been in place. And that is, I think, par for the course, right?
To what end, we should ask ourselves. What is the point of eradicating norms?
I think in this instance, it's not unusual for Donald Trump in the areas of free speech to have pushed boundaries, in the areas of law to have pushed boundaries. Look, he was as a businessman, he was a serial slapper. Strategic lawsuits against public participation, an avowed slapper, an open slapper. He said at one point after losing a lawsuit, I spent a few bucks, they spent thousands more. I did it to make them miserable. He literally said that. You can look it up. And that is, I think, part of it is trying to put people on the back foot, for sure, and create his own narrative.
I think the norms are there to prevent more serious abuses. And the targeting of the norms is in order to facilitate things that are worse. That if they can get rid of these things, then they will then be in a position to do things that are even worse. Like we saw with the Abrego case, and the kind of floating out things is, oh, he's just saying this in jest, but he was like, I think that you should send US citizens to El Salvador. We shouldn't presume that this administration won't try that. I think this administration will try anything that occurs to its leader as a whim, or on impulse. And there are these kind of annoying guardrails and norms and traditions and laws, irritating Supreme Court, these various other kinds of things that might get in the way of the unchecked ambition to do things that we would widely consider undemocratic.
Well, there's a major effort to move what's known as the Overton window, what's imaginable.
Right.
And now really almost anything is imaginable. But, as attention riveting as is the President of the United States, the world also is facing some free speech challenges. So Jacob, help us understand that larger context.
Yeah, I find myself in an interesting situation. I moved to the United States 2 years ago to set up a think tank to defend global free expression. And what better place to set up shop than America, which, according to Lee Bollinger, the former president of Columbia University, is the most speech protective of any nation now or throughout history. And for much of my career, I've been evangelizing a First Amendment approach to free speech to skeptical Europeans and even some doubtful Americans who are sort of tempted by laws against hate speech and disinformation and extremism. And so on. And I think for me, and along with a lot of other non-citizens who live here, embracing a First Amendment ideal of free speech is really like a rite of passage into American ideals, adopting it like a secular article of faith almost, and it unites us. And then suddenly, you find yourself in a situation where I'm leaving to go back to Denmark, where I'm from, in 10 days, and I don't know whether I'll be able to come back into the country because of things that I have said and written about the administration. And that is just something that would have never occurred to me. 100 days ago, that was unthinkable in a country which has welcomed the likes of Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein, Christopher Hitchens, Solzhenitsyn, all of who had admired the United States, but also had critical things to say about, racism, American foreign policy, and so on. It was taken as a given that, of course, this is a nation that is built on openness, and so I see this moment in time as really an inflection point. Maybe akin to like the Alien Seditions Act of 1798, the first Red Scare of the early 20th century, McCarthyism. And those were critical moments in American history where free speech, both the legal protection, but also the broader culture of free speech, which ultimately I think is more important than how you frame a law, because the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, but its legal protection was very different then to what it is now. That all depends on underlying perceptions in the population. But both the legal and the culture of free speech, I think, is under enormous strain right now. But my hope is that the accumulated resilience of those previous inflection points in American history will serve us well, because one of the good things that came out of those periods is that they were overcome. So, Thomas Jefferson wins the election of 1800, and the American people largely rejects the Federalist crackdown on free speech, and Jefferson gives this great, inaugural speech where he sort of says, well, free speech is what unites us, and we shouldn't persecute people for wrong ideas. Current First Amendment doctrine starts being influenced by the overreach during the first Red Scare, and of course the reaction to McCarthyism, crackdowns on the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, results in some of the landmark decisions that hopefully will now serve as a check on the overreach of the current administration. So, but I mean, this there's this process of free speech entropy, is what I call it. Essentially, we rally around free speech when it serves our purposes, but we tend to also to take it for granted. And so it sort of erodes over time, and it'll take sort of a jolt to the system to reinvigorate it. And that jolt is here right now, so I think it's time to sort of roll up our sleeves. You know, the founding generation, some of the patriots were, early patriots would gather not far from here in the Green Dragon Tavern, and they would, you know, drink rum and read Cato's letters, and they would, you know, defend the bulwark of liberty, which was free press. And I think now is the time to double down on defending the bulwark of liberty. And I hope I'll be allowed to stay in the country to help that fight.
Well, we all hope that, but I'm not going to let you off the hook about the world.
Yeah.
I mean, we have Hungary, we have Turkey,
Yes.
we have Venezuela. Let's go down the list. There are lots of countries where there is, even in their own traditions, a rollback of protections for the press and speech. So is that a trend, or are you seeing something that's pushing back against that development?
I think it's quite clear that for more than a decade, we've been living through a global free speech recession around the world. It's not surprising that your Chinas, your Irans, your Turkeys are eroding free speech. What's really worrying is that open democracies in Europe, the old world where I'm from, you see extremely disturbing developments. But the US is, you know, I think it's really, really alarming, you know, for instance, seeing the attempts to close Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, that has really played an essential role in promoting free speech, empowering dissidents in authoritarian countries. So America obviously does not have a perfect, spotless record, but for 80 years, you know, if you go back to FDR's first For Freedom speech in 1941, he sort of gives this vision for a new world. You know, once the war is over, what should be the governing principles? 4 freedoms. What's the very first freedom he mentions? Freedom of speech for everyone in the world. So free speech. And Eleanor Roosevelt fights a heroic battle to have really strong conceptions of free speech protections in international human rights law against the Soviet Union's attempt to sort of weaponize free speech restrictions. Europe and the U.S., you know, fights an important battle you know, to use free speech to empower dissidents behind the Iron Curtain through the so-called Helsinki process. And so there are many examples of the U.S. in particular being the most vocal champion of free speech globally. It seems to me that this administration is intent on rolling back that, and you know, I have not, maybe I'm wrong, but I have not heard, I've heard the administration call Zelensky a dictator, but I have not heard them address, you know, talk about Putin's systematic crackdown on free speech. I've not heard them criticize China for their crackdowns on free speech. And China and Russia and a group of countries that Ann Applebaum has called Autocracy Inc. are really stepping into the void that the U.S. has left to shape repressive global free speech norms, and that is likely to have an outsized impact of free speech around the world, and the U.S. will not be isolated from that.
And the U.S. is no longer a voice globally for free speech, not the UN, not in other fora.
It's on hiatus at the moment. Yeah.
Samantha, you have looked at the dark times in the United States and also seen the rise of protections for speech. You also are an expert on the defamation question in New York Times versus Sullivan. What are its prospects? Are we into a dark time? What's going to happen here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're definitely seeing some alarming threats to the press, that are being waged in particular through libel suits. We've seen a wave of libel actions against CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, and not just libel laws being mobilized. We're seeing actions for consumer fraud being brought against news organizations that report things that the administration finds to be defamatory or harmful in some way. And even though we have First Amendment protections in libel law that are very robust, these libel suits nevertheless can have a very damaging and chilling effect on the press, which has to expend significant resources to defend those lawsuits. So I'm worried about that trend, and I'm also worried about the campaign against New York Times versus Sullivan, which has been going on for about 8 years at least. And
why does it matter?
Yeah, so New York Times versus Sullivan is a landmark 1964 decision that instituted First Amendment protections in libel law. So Sullivan says that a public official or a public figure bringing a libel suit has to show that the statement was made with actual malice or reckless disregard of the truth. And that is a really high bar to clear. That affords very broad protection to the press to report on public affairs, to report on officials who might be litigious. It's an incredible shield, and it has served the press very well over the past 60 years. But there has been a recent attack, and there have been some who have claimed that Sullivan doesn't protect the interest in reputation, that it is being used to help foster attacks on conservative officials that are unfounded. And there's been some momentum on the part of this anti-Sullivan movement to get a case before the Supreme Court that would invite it to reconsider Sullivan or related cases. And I think it would be absolutely devastating for press freedom if those protections were to be altered or modified or rolled back in any way. And I'm afraid that could happen.
Jelani, you, as both a journalist and as an academic leader, have taken advantage of New York Times versus Sullivan, that it gives you room. When you advise emerging journalists, you talked about those who are international students, but even for those who are citizens, there are now risks of a different sort. There are risks to their personal safety. There are risks of doxing. How do you advise them as individuals and journalistic organizations to proceed in this climate?
Yeah, so I think that we're almost experiencing a kind of real-time study or examination of the principles that we would actually expect them to deploy later in their careers or in more hostile circumstances. So we, in their reporting classes, we teach them about kind of safety protocols and things that in reporting in hostile environments and those kinds of things. We did not particularly anticipate them utilizing those skills here in this moment. But that is what we're saying now. The kinds of precautions. I was quoted in the New York Times about something. It was not a full kind of description of what I was talking about when I said to the students that we can't protect you. And I was like being very clear. The work that we do entails an element of danger. And the protections that we do have are the protocols that we utilize to ensure our safety. And so, like, how do I approach this story? Under what circumstances am I maybe not the person? We were discussing about whether or not, particularly for international students, maybe you are not the person that is, since people are being doxxed and people are being kind of reported to the government, maybe you're not the visible person. Maybe this is a person who is a U.S. citizen who still would face particular kinds of jeopardies around this, but we don't have to worry about that person being deported. And so we're actually making those calculations in the United States right now. And so at the same time, we say this work has to get done. Yeah. We have continued to report. We've continued to report on stories that even our own university wasn't thrilled to see us reporting. And so we have done, the work, irrespective of which toes we may step on by doing it, but we should be very clear about the level of jeopardy, which is not unprecedented, but there are only a few precedents for this level of jeopardy for domestic American journalists, particularly student journalists.
Yeah, if I could get in on that, I'm also at a journalism school, the Newmark School. And when I came into this role leading the Journalism Protection Initiative, it was precisely with this mandate. You know, student journalists are going to have to practice their craft in a much more adversarial environment. How can we prepare them to do that from the ground up? And we're thinking about how to bring safety to all aspects, like as all journalism schools are. And there used to be a law and ethics class that's taught in journalism school, and it was kind of an academic exercise. You read a lot of U.S. case law. You just kind of taught U.S. journalists, like, this is kind of interesting to you, but it doesn't really affect you directly. You have
right.
as what Jacob would call, and citing Lee Bollinger, historic protections that no one else in the world has. We don't teach students that anymore. So we revamped this whole law and ethics course to now include law, ethics, and safety. And from the day that I get there, we have an orientation exercise where we train students at the Newmark School how to do a basic risk assessment. And we tell them, if you are going to succeed, you have to have the skills and resources and resilience to exercise journalism in a much more adversarial environment. And we integrate that into all areas of the curriculum so that when they graduate, they have those skills. But I also want to just point out something that Jelani mentioned, which is a particular concern, which is the students that are at our school. CUNY is a school of immigrants. We don't ask the status of the students, I have no idea what they are, but I will tell you they're extremely concerned about their ability to do their job and to put their bylines on their stories. And I talked to a bunch of students about the risk, and I said, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I cannot assure you that you can put your byline on your story and that there won't be consequences. I cannot assure you of that. So we're going to have to do a risk exercise together, and you're going to have to determine for yourself what the particular risks are based on your own status, your own immigration status, and what your own tolerance for risk is. These are exercises and practices that would have been routine for journalists deploying into a higher risk environment. They're now an exercise that we need to carry out for our own students in the United States.
Well, it's an issue for judges. 30 years ago, I taught judges from around the world and was shocked to learn that in some countries, judges wear masks when they go outside. And this is a genuine issue in this country right now. I have a lightning round, and then I want to open it up for comments or questions. Lightning round is, there has been a decline in the public support for free speech in the United States and maybe around the world. Why, and what does it take to turn that around? Who can I point to? Kevin?
Sure, I can go first. And actually I'm excited too, because I want to tie together something Jakob said and something Jelani said about norms. At Freedom Forum, we've done a survey for several years on the public's knowledge of and attitudes toward the First Amendment. It's currently called Where America Stands. For years, my colleague Gene Policinski ran it as the State of the First Amendment. And we found some of the inflection points as well. Now, we started it in 1997, so guess what one of the first inflection points was? 9/11. And another one was, of course, the financial recession. And another one was COVID. And we would see on each of these inflection points a decline in support for free speech and a corresponding increase in regulation in these areas. And yes, there were bounce backs, but there were also things always left behind. After 9/11, we saw so many laws at the state and federal level regarding access to information lost. And they have not come back. That access has not come back. And talking about norms, to tie it to norms, I think that's part of the intention too. How far can we push it till, and what doesn't come back? And maybe it breaks entirely. So what brought it back was demand from the public in a lot of areas, or at least pushback, and that's what we're going to have to count on. And if we have declining, support from the public about free speech, we're not going to have free speech.
Samantha.
Yeah, I just want to inject a note of optimism into all of this.
Thank you.
And just to say, if we go back, 60 years, 80 years, I think the public was less tolerant of freedom of speech and free speech ideals than it is today. So I think we've come a long way. Although certainly there are assaults on free speech and free speech norms, we're still ahead of where we were historically. And I think in terms of this question of what can we do to reinvigorate public support for free speech, historically, at these various free speech crises that you discussed, the McCarthy period, the World War I period, there's always sort of an effort to rethink and regroup. What does the First Amendment really mean? I think it's because of the McCarthy-era suppression that we do get so much support for freedom of speech in the following decade, which is enacted through Supreme Court decisions and this culture of free speech that arises in the 60s that is much more supportive of the right to dissent. So I think we may be at a moment like that, and that we might be able to move ahead because of the crisis that we're facing.
Rather than taking it for granted.
Yeah.
I think we have to be mindful of one thing in particular. So there's this movement for free speech that comes out of the allergic response to McCarthy. One of the best things, by the way, is the Freedom of Information Act, which is directly created in response to Joseph McCarthy. The other side of it, however, is that we have not given the full nature of the crisis of free speech that we're in, which is that this repression is being done under the guise of free speech.
Yeah.
So if you look at what Elon Musk has done on Twitter by kind of mainstreaming Nazis and violent or proto-violent groups that people thought should not be allowed on that platform, they've done that in the name of free speech at the same time that books are being banned. If you have a book about a trans child, that book is not going to be in public libraries in red states, at the same time as they're saying that they are leading a campaign for the protection of free speech. The other thing that I think is important to know is that, in the 1960s, this movement, particularly the Berkeley free speech movement emerged. Ronald Reagan, when he ran for governor in 1966, ran against the Berkeley free speech movement. And so it's not like this is a novel kind of idea. It's free speech for me, but not for thee. And so the landscape doesn't look like there's a universal crackdown on free speech. It looks like there are particular types of free speech, the types of free speech that are concerned with placing a check on government authority and the ability to make incursions into people's lives. Those things will be stigmatized, while language, as we saw J.D. Vance went to Germany to take up the cause of far-right groups, as if that is, when we think about all of the many causes in the world to which the weight of the White House administration should lend itself, I think that's not one. But what we see is free speech more oriented toward that than toward what we're talking about.
Jakob.
Yeah, so we recently put out a survey where we looked at attitudes towards free speech in 33 countries around the world, and worryingly, we did the first one in 2021, the US dropped from 3rd to 9th, and most worryingly, younger generations seems to be less tolerant of controversial speech, if you like, than newer ones. So that's definitely a shift that we need to address. I will say one thing that right now we've talked about sort of pushback or erosion of free speech coming from the right, from conservatives, but I also think that we need to recognize that for more than a decade, there's been, even among First Amendment scholars in the US and some of the media organizations who are now under attack, this fad of saying, hey, we need to rethink the First Amendment. The First Amendment is being weaponized against democracy. The First Amendment enshrines white supremacist values. If you're a civil libertarian, you're a dupe for neo-Confederate values. I mean, this is not me being hyperbolic. This is like actual scholarship and articles that are being written. And I think not only is that completely at odds with sort of the development of the First Amendment, Samantha has a forthcoming book which details this and I, have been fortunate to read a first sort of draft article of it. It's beautifully written and very convincing. But also because, once you start saying, well, we need to have certain viewpoint restrictions on free speech because we think those particular restrictions actually support democracy. They support tolerance. I mean, it's very, very obvious what you're playing a very dangerous game because in a democracy, power changes and new people come into power and they have different ideas than you. And so you're only ever a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of sort of viewpoint-based restrictions on free speech. And guess what? You know, a lot of those who are your ideological opponents feel just as morally justified in imposing those restrictions than you do. They are certain that they're in the right and that you're in the wrong. And so I think we need to sort of rediscover that civil libertarian defense of principled, consistent free speech that has been the hallmark of the First Amendment since the late 50s, early 60s, and that has really been, I think, a bedrock principle, really, of also empowered important progressive social movements.
That's not entirely it, though.
I promised a question. I promised the
reason,
audience.
The reason why that's not entirely it is that
It's not gonna happen.
we have a very clear and widely defined cutout around, for instance, workplace. Like, we don't think that we have an incursion into free speech if we prohibit people from talking about the physical shape of their employee, or from making a sexual or racial or in some other kind of derogatory comment about someone in the workplace. And the idea is that we do have values that we consider to be core to democracy, in this case, core to an effective workplace, and that we've made a reasonable judgment. So what happens is that if we say that in order to be able to articulate an idea of, say, Martin Luther King's March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech, we also have to, broach speech that, say, Brandenburg, the Brandenburg ruling would say, this speech in this immediate moment could actually lead to a kind of violent outcome. Like, we have these kinds of ideas. The problem is that people are now being, under the guise of free speech, weaponizing, the ideas and ideologies and the language that actually has jeopardized people.
Well, and particularly fueled by corporate uses of speech to attack regulation. So the weaponizing of free speech phrase started with the recognition of this corporate commercial speech attack on regulation. So, Joel, you get 1 minute, but somebody has to ask a question.
I just want to get in on the so-called lightning round.
Yes.
So just
It's not even like lightning, it's more like just electricity at this point.
Right.
Like,
Well, anyway, very quickly trying to synthesize a couple points to make. I agree the fundamental problem is the weaponization of free speech as we sort of, this has become the battleground. I actually agree with Samantha, and I know I've been the voice of doom and gloom. I'm really just trying to sound the alarm. I actually don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I just want people to be a little bit scared. I don't know if that's pushing against an open door in this room, but that's my goal. But I agree with her that the debate, I am actually optimistic that the fact that we're talking about it and we're engaging with it could lead to some very positive outcomes. But my final point is that the real enemy of free speech around the world, it's government. If you look at the data, there's a new report out from VDEM, the Varieties of Democracies Index that's published by the Gutenberg Institute in Sweden, that shows that democracy is on the decline around the world. There's a very short window to turn it around, usually 3 to 5 years once democratic backsliding begins. But the primary target in democratic backsliding is free speech. It's the media, and these are attacks carried out by governments, and we really shouldn't lose track. There's a certain value in self-reflection and all of that, but the real the enemy of free speech around the world are authoritarian governments.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'll try to speak loud. My name is Sam Weiss, and I'm with C-SPAN.
We have actually a mic. One moment. No need.
Hi, my name is Sam, and I'm with C-SPAN. And when I arrived at C-SPAN last fall, I discovered that universities
would frequently not allow our cameras into events when conservatives were the guest because they were fearful, embarrassed, potentially, that their students, left of center, were going to shout down, because it frequently happened, any conservative on stage. But we were welcome to send our cameras when a Democrat or a liberal was on stage. And I was trying to figure out, why are we not, there are conservatives speaking at college campuses, but we're not allowed to have our cameras in. So you were talking about the official government crackdown, Joel. How much do you think the left is responsible for their own de facto crackdown on free speech?
I think there's a lot of blame that can go around in a lot of places, but I don't think that this moment of loss of fervent attachment in the United States to speech can be attributed to one side or another. For me, it is very much affected by young people's experience on platforms. And the experience of being in chat rooms and being riveted by it, the research is very powerful, that if there's negative communication going on, people stay longer. It's not just outrage, it's negativity. And then not knowing how to protect themselves. I think that this is a far bigger issue, and it doesn't have a political valence. Do we have time for one more? We do. Thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Sarah Nordgren from Associated Press, and a couple things. Number one, AP is always more comfortable covering the news than being the subject of the news, so this has been an uncomfortable few months for us. But just a comment that I have, I think, we in this room are largely independent storytellers, and we have an opportunity through explanatory journalism and videos to help audience understand the importance of free press. Jelani, you made the point that FOIA was an important act. FOIA actually is fairly nonpartisan support. I think by telling the kinds of stories that help people understand what Sullivan means and how freedom of information benefits not just left-leaning causes, but your right-leaning causes as well, is an important tool. The other comment that I have is, and it's a broader one, we need to help young people understand why they want to become journalists and why they want to really step up and tell stories for the world, because that's key for all of our futures, I think.
Can I say something really quick?
Please.
So I don't know, Joel, I'd be interested in your experiences about this. There are generally fewer young people applying to journalism school, certainly on the graduate level. But we have not seen kind of uniform shrinkage. Like in any application pool, you have some people who are kind of like, I don't know what to do next. I'll do this and see how it goes. And then people who were kind of like, I'm somewhat motivated. I think this is interesting. It could be fun. And then you have people who were like editor of their junior high school paper, editor of their high school paper, have a picture of Morley Safer on their wall as a child.
Is that right? Morley Safer?
I know.
Is that a real thing?
No, the reason I say that, just as an aside, I actually, as a young person, did track Morley Safer down. I ran him down in an airport to get his autograph.
Wow.
When I was a college student. That's a true story.
God bless.
And so, but nonetheless, our application pool is much more of the people who are in that last category. The people who are coming into journalism school, they know what a story is, they want to report, they are undaunted by the financial prospects. It is if you want a bit of inspiration about this field, interact with the people who are coming into journalism school now. They are amazing.
That's great.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I mean, I'm not involved in the admission process. Graciela Lachowski tells me that we have a robust application pool, and she's excited about the next class. But I do get to engage with the students. And in that regard, I totally agree. There's lots of doom and gloom here, and there's nothing that energizes me more than, despite the obstacles, despite the challenges, seeing like the commitment and excitement about journalism among people, students, young people who know they're going to be practicing this craft in an extremely difficult environment with huge challenges. That's really inspiring.
Amazing to end on a positive note. I just want to underscore that the norms, the spirit, the underlying values of speech, that is what needs to be revived and recirculated. And the young people who are committed are one of the sources, but it is also up to some of us old people. Thank you, and please join me in thanking the panel.